Jan Hus, John Hus, 1369 to 1450. 1415, that didn't come out very clearly. Jan Hus was a Bohemian priest in the town of Husinec. Husinec, that's where it comes from, means goose town. Jan Goose, John of the Goose, from the town of Husinec in southern Bohemia. In the 1390s, he encountered Wycliffe's ideas as they spread across Europe. Remember, they couldn't spread as quickly because this is prior to what? The invention of the printing press, at least in the West, in the middle of the next century. In 1391, he was appointed preacher at Bethlehem Chapel and was made the rector of the University of Prague. If you go to Prague today, you can go see Bethlehem Chapel and these places and sort of follow the life of Jan Hus. Remember, one of the pre-Reformation reformers. Most probably due to the influence of Wycliffe's ideas, he translated the Bible into Czech. You always seem to, it seems to be connected with the work of the Spirit of God amongst a people when there is a desire to translate the scriptures into the language of that people. And so he does this. He preaches the doctrines of Wycliffe, was very popular in Prague. And this one always caught me because here's another, I do have I have varied interests. They all are somewhat related, though not necessarily all the cycling and running and rowing stuff. But he also confessed, sort of in a sense of confession, he also confessed to like to play chess. And I love to play chess too. I don't have time anymore. And to play well, to get better than I once was as a kid, because I was very good as a kid. I mean, if you're 14, you play 1800 USCF level chess against 60-year-olds at 14. Yeah, I really got into it as a kid. Would take too much time. You just have to study so many openings. It's just not really a possibility anymore. And I have numerous chess programs on my iPhone that can crush me with regularity, so it's not quite as exciting. But anyways, Jan Hus liked to play chess. Theologically, he drank deeply of Wycliffe. He denied transubstantiation, which Wycliffe had recognized was a modern dogma. And it was. At that time, it was barely 150, 160 years old as far as dogmatic status was concerned. Taught justification by faith alone and said that Christ, not the Pope, is the head of the church. And if you've watched some of the Luther movies, when Eck goes after Luther at the Leipzig Disputation, this is what he's quoting from. He's quoting from Jan Hus and specifically saying that Christ, not the Pope, is the head of the church and things along those lines. As a result of these teachings, he was summoned to the Council of Constance in 1414 under a promise of safe conduct from King Sigismund. Now, the Council of Constance was not called about Jan Hus. It was called to heal the schism in the papacy, which we'll talk about here in a moment. Well, depending on how much time we have. And so they had bigger fish to fry, but he was called before the council since it was meeting. Why not? King Sigismund gives him a promise of safe conduct. And so he comes into town with a small army of supporters and protectors. So what his enemies did is they just kept putting off dealing with him until many of those supporters and protectors had to go back home. They had crops to take care of. They had lands to manage. And so finally that small army is gone, and so Hus is arrested and brought before the council July 6th, 1415. He asked repeatedly to be shown from Scripture where he had erred. Sounds familiar. His entreaties were ignored. He was forced to sit during his farcical trial, dressed in a black robe, wearing a dunce cap with devils painted on it. If you want any further evidence of how ridiculously unfair the trial itself was. Wow, I found this old copy of The Fatal Flaw, and I just opened it up and found a business card, and it is one of my old. This would be sometime after '89, but it's got our old phone number, 266-2537, fax area 99.
Oh yeah.
Remember that? Yeah. There it is. That was in the back. I hadn't seen that. It's fun when you find that old stuff in your books. Go, wow. See when I last looked at this. But here is the story of his death. It's found in The Fatal Flaw, which it just comes from Philip Schaff. Hus was led by an armed guard of 1,000 men to the place of his death. Here's Philip Schaff's story. It was midday. The prisoner's hands were fastened behind his back and his neck bound to the stake by a chain. On the same spot sometime before, so the chronicler notes, a cardinal's worn-out mule had been buried. The straw and wood were heaped up around Hus's body to the chin, and rosin sprinkled upon them. The offer of life was renewed if he would recant. He refused and said, I shall die with joy today in the faith of the gospel which I have preached. When Rickenthal, who was standing by, suggested a confessor, he replied, there is no need of one. I have no mortal sin. At the call of the bystanders, they turned his face away from the east, and as the flames arose, he sang twice, Christ, thou Son of the living God, have mercy upon me. The wind blew the fire into the martyr's face, and his voice was hushed. He died praying and singing. To remove, if possible, all chance of preserving relics from the scene, Hus's clothes and shoes were thrown into the merciless flames. The ashes were gathered up and cast into the Rhine River. So there was the end of Jan Hus at the Council of Constance. And so I ask you to keep in mind the fact that 106 years later, Martin Luther is riding in a wagon into the city of Worms. And according to at least some sources, he sees scrawled on the wall in German, Luther the Saxon Hus. And this would have communicated to him that even though he had the promise of safe conduct from the emperor, that he was a heretic just as Hus was. And Luther had admitted by this point in time he was a Hussite. He had not known that when he had started. Eck had forced him to come to that realization at the Leipzig disputation. But what would that have communicated to Martin Luther? But that he was going to his death. And that really is what he was thinking. That really was what he was expecting, as he did not believe that the safe conduct promise that had been given to him would have any more positive effect for him than it had for Jan Hus. And so there is the Hussite heresy, which, while somewhat suppressed for a time being, would once again come to the fore in Martin Luther. Now, it's very, very important, and I only have a few minutes before we wrap up. And I've said this before, but so much of this is new to so many people that it's important to repeat things and emphasize their importance. There were many factors that came together in the rise of the Reformation. And if we don't recognize what they were, we will end up with an inaccurate, invalid view of what took place at the time of the Reformation. One of the things that happened was a degradation of the power and authority of the papacy itself. And it wasn't so much due to the pornocracy way back in the 10th century and at that time. No, this is a much more recent memory, and it's called the Babylonian Captivity of the Church. And basically what this was, what it refers to, is the papacy had been involved in political activities since the 6th century and before. At times, who the pope would be was decided by who had the biggest army, or who had the most amount of money, who had the most political influence. By the beginning of the 14th century, the Franks, had gained the upper hand in the control of the papacy. You control the cardinals, you control the papacy. In 1305, the Archbishop of Bordeaux was elected as Pope, and he took the name Clement V. But he never went to Rome. Instead, he was the first Avignon Pope, for he moved the papacy to Avignon, France. So he was elected by the French cardinals, but said, I'm not really big on that Italy thing. I like things here better. And so moved the papacy to Avignon, France. For most of the rest of the 14th century, no pope lived in Rome. No pope lived in Rome. Clement was succeeded by John the 22nd, a ruthless, powerful man who was then succeeded by Benedict the 12th. Remember, we had Benedict the 16th, who's still alive, actually. And Benedict the 12th began the construction of the papal palace in Avignon. Benedict was involved in helping France against England in the 100 Years' War, as was his successor, Clement VI. Clement was an extravagant spender, even buying Avignon for the papacy. Hey, I like this city. Let's buy it. His successor, Innocent VI, was equally wasteful in spending money, and he spent a good deal of time working on regaining papal control over Italy, which had been seriously compromised by the move to Avignon, which makes sense. Now, Urban V was a simple man who wished to see reform in the church. He returned to Rome in 1367, began rebuilding projects, but eventually gave up the effort and returned to Avignon in 1370. The next Pope, Gregory the 11th, left Avignon in 1376, returned to Rome. Upon his death in 1378, however, Urban VI was elected. However, the cardinals, about 80% of which were French, had become accustomed to their privilege and getting to live in France. And upon finding Urban II independently minded, they declared his election null and void and elected another pope, Clement VIII. Armed forces of the two popes clashed. Clement retired to Avignon in 1381, marking the beginning of the Great Schism. France, so now you've got two popes. You've got one in Rome, you've got one in Avignon. France, Spain, and Scotland supported Clement VII. Italy, the Empire, the Scandinavian nations, and England supported Urban. Parallel elections continued right into the next century, with neither side willing to compromise with the other. Both popes are involved in anathematizing the other pope, and hence their followers in other nations. You now have Europe completely split between a two-headed church. Some of the cardinals from both sides met at Pisa in 1409 because they recognized this could not continue on. Attempted to heal the schism. Both popes refused to attend, so the cardinals deposed both popes and elected another, Alexander V, but neither of the first two popes accepted the third, so now there were three popes after the Council of Pisa. The council also raised what's called the conciliar issue, that being the idea that a council was superior to a pope. Finally, in 1414, the Council of Constance was called, which we just made reference to in regards to Jan Hus. It sat for 4 years, from 1414 to 1418. We know in 1415 what they did with Jan Hus. In 1417, a new pope, Martin V, was elected by the Council of Constance, and the other three agreed to his election. So you had a healing of the schism, but that healing required a council. And so for a period of time, there is a rise in conciliarism, the view that councils are superior to the papacy. It seemed for a while that conciliarism had triumphed, but this triumph was short-lived, and soon the popes were again proclaiming their superiority to the councils, and men died who continued to hold to the conciliar position, even though historically the papacy had not been able to heal itself. It required a council to do so. So why is this important? Because the Great Schism and the Babylonian captivity shook people's confidence in the divine authority of the papacy. It was not that long ago that they knew that which pope you followed depended upon which nation you were in. And it was clearly driven by politics, and that no one really knew which pope was the right pope. And even to this day, when Roman Catholics say, oh, we can trace ourselves all the way back, they have to make things up as they go along, as they go through those periods. Who was the true pope? Nobody then knew. It's ridiculous to say, well, it was this guy. Well, you know, if you don't accept Avignon popes, there wasn't a papacy for an entire period of time. So it had shaken people's confidence at that point in time in the papacy. So that's one of the first things that was necessary. Because what is Luther fundamentally saying when he openly rejects the selling of indulgences? Papal authority is not final. The scripture is. Well, you can't do that when everyone thinks the Pope is the final authority in all things. So that's one of the issues.